Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. In December of 2014, I was in the process of completely starting over. I just walked away from my previous company, and frankly, I needed to figure out what the hell to do with my life. And around that time, I got an email from my friend Suzanne, and she was headed to Tony Robbins' Date with Destiny. It was an event coming up about 2 weeks from then, and she said that I should go. Now, like many of you, I've been a student and a fan of Tony's for over a decade, but I'd never made it to one of his events before. So I bought my ticket, and 2 weeks later, I was in Boca with about 2,500 other people. Well, it turns out that our guest today was there as well. His name is Joe Berlinger. Joe is an Emmy award-winning filmmaker, and in fact, he's one of the most famous documentary producers in the world, with an Academy Award nomination and 2 Emmys sitting on his shelf. Well, Joe was there with his team in Boca because Tony was the subject for his next film called I Am Not Your Guru. And today, well, he's going to join us to take us behind the scenes of his career and how he convinced Tony to make that film and how that event changed both of our lives. And in fact, Self-Made Man in this podcast is a direct result of the vision that I created for my new future at that event. If I hadn't gotten that invite from Suzanne and attended Date with Destiny, you and I, frankly, would not be here listening to this amazing interview with Joe today. So if you haven't seen the film, watch it tonight. It will leave you more empowered than you can imagine. And if you haven't been to Date with Destiny, please make it your number one priority to attend. He only holds it one time per year in the United States and one other additional location in Australia, and that is it. But go. It will absolutely change your life. So with that being said, please help me welcome one of the most talented filmmakers of our time, Joe Berlinger. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Mike Dillard here, and I have an absolutely fascinating guest joining us here for this week's episode. Mr. Joe Berlinger, who is the producer and director of the brand new documentary that's just come out, I Am Not Your Guru, which is based on Tony Robbins. So, Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I've been looking forward to this interview for one really big reason, and that is the fact that I was actually in the audience 2 years ago at Date with Destiny in Florida when you guys were filming this movie, and I had no idea that that's what was actually being produced. But
that's awesome.
How cool was that?
No, that you had mentioned that before we started, so that's really cool. My reaction when you first told me was like, "Oh my God, you're kidding!" But since I know that already, my reaction is more muted, but still, nonetheless, I love the fact that you were in the audience. That's great. How was it having us make a film?
I didn't even notice you. You know, to be quite honest, I didn't even notice the cameras going around, and I'm so used to events being filmed that it was just par for the course.
Yeah, great. Yeah, we tried. It was really important to Tony that the filmmaking, and we talked a lot about it, and that was his biggest stumbling block to saying yes. It took me 2 years to convince him to make the film. His biggest stumbling block was he was concerned that a documentary would impede with the attendees' experience, and I repeatedly convinced him, or tried to convince him, and ultimately did, that cameras are a part of life, and we would not get in the way. So,
well, let's before we dive into that, I would love to take everybody back, a couple of decades to how you actually got your start in film, because you've been doing this for quite a while. You've got a giant list of films that you've produced over the last decade or two. What inspired you to get interested in making films?
Yeah, I've had a very circuitous route to filmmaking, which I marvel at because, I guess you could say I'm one of the leading documentarians, in the business, but that was never the goal, so it's just interesting how life happens. I mean, basically, I was a language major in college. I was fluent in German because I studied it, not because I live, not because I'm got a German family or anything like that. I just was fascinated by languages, became particularly fluent in German. I went to Colgate University in upstate New York, graduated in '83. And my only goal at that time was to figure out how someone would pay me to live in Europe and speak languages. So I was looking for a job that was language based, and I wanted to live in Europe because I had an amazing experience studying for a year in Switzerland as part of my German major in college. And so somehow I bluffed my way into a job at one of the largest advertising agencies in the world called Ogilvy and Mather, based in New York, but they had a Frankfurt office, and they were looking for somebody who spoke some languages to coordinate a particular project. So I ended up in Frankfurt, Germany in 1985. And the first time I was actually around cameras in any meaningful way was on a TV commercial shoot, a series of shoots that we were doing where I was more of an account service guy who spoke languages and was there to just make everyone feel good about the job. And that's when the kind of the light bulb and the magic of lights, camera, action kind of went off in my head. I figured out how to get back to the New York office of Ogilvy and Mather as a producer now on a junior producer on American Express commercials. We then hired, as some of your listeners may or may not know, advertising agencies write and create commercials, but they hire production companies to actually shoot them and direct them. So we hired these famous documentary makers called the Maisel brothers to shoot these unscripted American Express commercials. Now, unscripted real people commercials at that time was unusual. It's very common now. Documentary style commercials. We thought, hey, let's hire real documentarians. So we hired these guys called the Maisel brothers, who are seminal, people in my field, along with D.A. Penny Baker and Robert Drew. The Maisel brothers are the guy, and Leacock. These are the guys who invented the modern documentary, the modern cinema verite documentary. That we could talk about this, in another form. But we hired these guys, and I hit it off with one of the brothers, David Maisels, and they were looking for more action from advertising agencies because they realized it was a great way to support their documentary making was to get paid to do commercials. That's something I've been part of my DNA for 25 years is commercial making as a way to support, documentary making, because documentary making can often be, not a hugely profitable business. So you need to find ways to supplement your income. Anyway, I hit it off with these guys. They were looking for somebody to come help them get more commercials. I was looking to get into the film business. But interestingly, I wasn't necessarily looking to get into documentaries. I've always said that had we hired some big Hollywood director like Ridley Scott back in 1986 to shoot this American Express commercial, maybe I would have hit it off with Ridley Scott and gone to California and had a completely different kind of filmmaking career. Looking back now, I actually believe everything happens for a reason, and there's a reason I make documentaries, and it's been a fantastic life, just dropping into people's lives for a week, a month, 2 decades in the case of the West Memphis 3, which we can talk about, which is the films the Paradise Lost trilogy are the films I'm most known for. Those are the 3 films over 2 decades that actually got innocent people out of prison, 1 guy on death row, 2 guys life without parole. So I believe I'm here on a mission of shining a light on injustice, giving a voice to the voiceless. That's what's kept me going all these years, but it started off quite coincidentally.
So how do you choose which projects you want to pursue? Is it based on your own kind of personal interest and just what perks you up?
Yeah. I jokingly tell my friends that I do music and murder. A lot of my films before the Tony Robbins film, and there's a whole reason I chose that film. A lot of my films have been about the criminal justice system and social justice and, wrongful conviction, or, in the case of Crude, about pollution in the Amazon, where bad oil drilling practices created a cancer death zone the size of Rhode Island. And when those start depressing me, then I run off and I make a music film. So I made a film about Metallica called Metallica, Some Kind of Monster. I made a film about Paul Simon called Under African Skies. I think I'm interested in individual stories that shine a light on some universal theme about the human condition. I think I'm interested in telling stories about exploding stereotypes. I mean, in fact, the Tony Robbins film fits into that very bucket very neatly, because I think there's a lot of misperceptions about who Tony is, what he does, his impact, and the whole self-help movement. In fact, although he hates that word self-help, but for ease of describing the world we're in, I use that phrase, even though Tony doesn't like it. You know, I've had the great pleasure of, being able to just constantly feed myself and learn about new worlds. And I've come to realize recently, it's, a recent revelation that, even though I feel like I choose my subjects, in many ways, my subjects choose me, in the sense that at any given time, I'm always developing and pitching multiple ideas. And, for every 5 projects I pitch or develop, one actually happens. That's just the nature of the film business. And the ones that actually happen, and this is my new revelation, are the ones that I needed that lesson at that time in my life. And all of these films have taught me something about me or the human condition that I needed to learn at that time. And again, that fits really neatly into the Tony Robbins film, because the whole journey of making that film was a journey of skepticism to belief. And I needed that in my life at that time.
Well, let's dive into, that's a perfect transition point on how you came to meet Tony and the idea for this project came about.
Well, interestingly, I met Tony, interestingly to me, because again, it's just the role of chance and coincidence in life. I met Tony socially in 2012, had no inkling I was going to make a film about him, nor did he want a film about him. But we met in 2012. He was a fan of the Metallica film, actually. And again, maybe your viewers are not necessarily film people, but Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, is kind of a seminal film in rock and roll history, or in the history of rock docs, because it kind of turned the whole image of the rock icon on its head and humanized these guys, because they were going through, difficulties relating to one another. They felt chained by their image of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because now they were becoming family men and having kids, and, wanted to keep making music, but not live the sex, drugs, and rock and roll ethos to the degree they had been living it. And so they hired a therapist, a band therapist, and which sounds funny and unusual, but the film is actually a very deep meditation on the nature of, the creative process, on relationships, on collaboration, on all sorts of issues that I think Tony is very interested in. So we had a very deep and meaningful conversation about the film. And, I had very little knowledge of who Tony was, other than the most superficial, like, he's a well-known self-help guy who does DVDs and had those infomercials and had that Shallow Hal cameo, in the Gwyneth Paltrow Jack Black movie. So I had very superficial knowledge, but we ended up having this very deep and meaningful conversation. So he later told me, he didn't tell me at the time, but he later sensed that I had some issues going on in my life based on our conversation. I wasn't overtly selling my issues, and he wasn't telling me that he was aware of them at the time, but he sensed that I might get something out of Date with Destiny, because I said to him, I didn't even know you did live seminars, when he was telling me all the things he does. So he invited me to Date with Destiny. And that year, in the film, it takes place in Boca Raton, Florida, because he moved his home and to Palm Beach, and, he does it near his house. At the time, it was in Palm Springs, California, because he used to have a home near there. So I went to the one in 2012 as a participant when it was out there. And look, I'm a workaholic. I guess that's part of my problem, or was. I rarely take 6 days for a vacation, let alone carve out 6 days to go to a thing called Date with Destiny, which to a skeptical New Yorker sounded like the biggest hunk of cheese you could imagine. And also, like back in 2012, I would have told you I'm not a self-help guy. I'm not a seminar guy. I'm busy. And yet I found myself getting on the plane and landing in California and picking up my rental car and driving into this desert to this cheesy thing called Date with Destiny, thinking, oh my God, if my friends could see me now, what am I doing? And, obviously I needed it. And there was something about our conversation that really I found compelling with Tony. So I entered the hallowed halls of Date with Destiny at a giant resort ballroom in Palm Springs, California. Actually, Palm Desert, California it was at, and which is near Palm Springs. And within the first 2 hours, as anyone who knows, the first 2 hours are particularly raucous, loud music, dancing, because he's trying to get you into a certain physical state.
Did you jump?
I reluctantly jumped, and every red flag was going off. The music, the dancing, the pairing off with a stranger, the idea that I'm going to spend the next 6 days revealing my most intimate emotions to a stranger. It was more than I can handle, and I quite literally fled for the exit doors after the first break. And I called my wife and I said, "Oh my God, I have got to get the hell out of here. I don't know what I've signed up for, but this is not for me." And my wife wisely counseled me, "Well, look, you've carved out the time. You're out there. Just give it another day." And part of it too was, I thought I was coming anonymously. I thought it was very nice that Tony invited me, but I didn't think he would even remember that I had been invited. Not because there's anything against him, but he's a busy guy. And, I just figured, okay, I'm here and I'm taking advantage of this invitation, but it's really my own experience to shape the way I want. And when I arrived, there was somebody with a clipboard who was very aware of my presence. And as I've learned in the last 2 years and learned at that moment, Tony is very generous with inviting people to the event that he meets from all walks of life, whether you're in financial need or not. He invites lots of people. And, at any given Date with Destiny, there's 20 or 30 people he's invited. And there's somebody on his staff who's one of their responsibilities is to make sure you're having a good time and participating. And that's the thing that kind of flipped me out. Like, it was clear that I was here to participate. And so I fled, called my wife, and I said, "Look, I don't want to insult the guy, but I got to get out of here. What's your advice?" And she said, "Look, give it another day. You've carved out the time, give it another day." So on day 2, there was a guided memory exercise, a glimpse of which you see in film, because he does this at each one. So again, this is the one where I'm attending and I have no idea I want to make a film. So there's this guided memory exercise where Tony challenges you to remember your earliest childhood memory. And in that process, he then challenges you, and I'm greatly simplifying it here for the sake of the podcast, because we don't, it's a much more complicated process, but he then challenges you to recover a memory that precedes that earliest memory that you've long repressed or forgotten about, because in recovering that memory, it's often a key to liberating you from the thing that's holding you back, because most of us can trace a lot of our issues to childhood. And I'm in a room of 2,500 people. In 2012, as I said, I would have told you I'm not a seminar guy. I'm not a self-help guy. I'm a tough New Yorker who's taken on prosecutors and polluting corporations and FBI corruption. I look at the world with a very jaundiced eye. And I would have also told you that I'm not a crier, and I opened my eyes after this 40-minute process, flooded in tears, cried in a way that I can't remember ever crying. I felt this weight lift. Now, it's not like the heavens parted, the angels appeared, and like my life was just glowingly perfect at that moment, but I felt lighter. And so I thought to myself, okay, if something can make me feel this way, I'm going to give it a go. It's got a cheesy name. It's got some aspects to it that really make me uncomfortable. But instead of being judgmental and dismissive about it, I'm going to dive in and do this, which is what I did. So I gave it my all over the 6 days. And at the end of it, I called Tony and thanked him profusely for a truly transformative experience, which gave me some tools to handle my stuff. We all have stuff, obviously. Some of us have stuff that's more traumatic than others, but we all have stuff. And, to yourself, your stuff is your stuff. You can't quantify it or compare it. And shared with him also, I told him everything I just said here, which is like my initial reaction was horror, and my ultimate reaction was one of deep gratitude. And I also, by about day 4 of the 6-day program, that's when I was thinking, wow, this will make an amazing film. There's something inherently cinematic about the journey that a lot of these people who go to this event take, like myself. And, even though it's a highly produced seminar, it produces raw and real emotion that I wanted to capture on film. And also, I've never quite seen in, what happens in that room, meaning it's a room of 2,500 people from all walks of life, all socioeconomic strata, all reasons for being in that room. Some people have suffered some serious trauma, as you see in the film. Some people are just super achievers wanting to get to the next level. There's people from all different belief systems, 7 countries in the particular one I filmed, or actually multiple countries, 7 languages being translated simultaneously. So it's a huge, diverse pool of people. And yet boundaries between people quickly dissolve. There's a love and connection between people that I haven't quite experienced. You realize you're not just there to work on yourself, but you're also there to connect in a meaningful way with other people, which is scary and off-putting to some people. And, but I felt like that communal feeling that's evoked, that very healthy, positive connection between people, is something I wanted to bring to documentary, to put on the screen. Because, I think we live in very divisive times. I think people shout at each other. You can live in a very siloed existence, listen to CNN and hear one version of the news, or MSNBC, then turn to Fox and listen to another version of the news. And people are just yelling at each other, and there's no connection between people. And I think as a society, we're in a lot of pain because there's not any empathy for the other side. And so this is a room that creates this tremendous empathy, and I wanted to try to bring that to the screen. So those were all my motivations for wanting to do the film. I pitched it to Tony thinking he would high five me and say, yes, when can we start? But instead he was, very concerned about making the film, and I had to chase him for 2 years. I called him every couple of months and convinced him to finally do it.
What were those concerns? Because, Tony's been on the air more than any other human being on the planet, as far as his infomercials go, for 20 years now. So what were his fears?
Well, those infomercials are things he controls. So, I think, although he didn't give me this as a reason, but I'm sure he felt a lack of control, handing over the bringing of cameras into the one event that he is not exposed to the outside world to an independent filmmaker. I'm sure that's understandably scary, but his articulated reasons were twofold. One, he was, and I think I alluded to it before, he was very concerned about this experience interfering with, he was very concerned about my filmmaking interfering with the attendees' experience, which is, paramount to him. As you know, since you attended, he has cameras there as well, because he projects, what's going on in the room on these giant jumbotron screens at the front of the, stage, so that no matter where you're sitting in that giant ballroom, no matter where the action is, just like at a rock concert, you can always see what's going on by looking up at the screen. So he's got those kinds of cameras there, but those cameras hang back. They're usually on tripods, or, they're just not in your face the way a documentarian is. And when you see the film, you'll see how up close and personal we got. So he was concerned that the process of letting independent filmmakers in would be disruptive, basically. And I convinced him that I've dropped into many sensitive situations over the years and have not gotten in the way. And I also, made a deal with him. I said, look, I'll take the risk. I will come. And if you feel I'm intrusive, originally I was trying to get him to agree to give me the access and to, unequivocally give me the access so that I can then go to a funding partner like HBO or Netflix or whomever. I should say Netflix, because they're the ones who ended up I partnering with, and raising the money prior to making the film or to shooting it. But he didn't want to give me that carte blanche in advance because he didn't know if it was going to interfere with the attendees' experience. So I said, look, I won't raise money in advance. I'll come at my own risk. And if at any time you feel I'm in the way, whether it's the first minute or the last minute, and you want to cancel the film, then we'll pull the plug. That doesn't mean he had editorial control. It would have to be if we got through the 6 days, it would have to be my film. I have final cut. It's my film to make. But if you feel it's interfering at any time during the event, we'll just shut it down and I'll give you the footage and you can just, cover my minimal expenses of having shown up to try to shoot this thing. But if we get through it, I will find the production partner, which I did, Netflix, and I will make a film. And he agreed to that. I think he responded to my passion, because I wouldn't let it go. I did it. I called him repeatedly. Then his other big concern, which I understand, is that, it's, as you know, since you've been to the event, it's a 72-hour content-rich event. And so his concern was, how do you take 72 hours and condense it to a documentary length, which is 2 hours or less, without trivializing the content or without misrepresenting things. And so that was his big concern. And for me, that was just an education process with him. As I said to him, all documentary is hyper reality in the sense that it's a condensation of time. And a good filmmaker knows how to condense time while staying true to the emotional truthfulness of the experience, while capturing the essence of what something is about, while not actually presenting the literal truth. And what I mean by the literal truth is the literal truth of Date with Destiny is 72 hours. The emotional truth is the 2 hours I was able to capture. And so I did that by just showing him a bunch of films, my films, other films. And, the biggest example or the most concrete example I can give is, I made a film called Paradise Lost, made that with my now late partner, Bruce Sinofsky. And Paradise Lost, is about a murder trial, basically a wrongful conviction case. And, we were there for the actual murder trials. The murder trials lasted, because there were two of them, it was 6 full weeks. But in my 2.5 hour documentary, you only see about an hour of actual murder trial. And so you're trusting the filmmaker to condense 6 weeks of a murder trial to 1 hour, which captures the emotional essence of what went on in that courtroom. No documentary is the objective truth about anything, but what you're trusting is that the filmmaker is going to capture the emotional essence and the emotional truthfulness of a situation. So, he watched a few of my films, we had a few conversations, and I think he realized that he had a responsible filmmaker who could do this.
I'm sitting here wondering how you and your crew handled the production schedule, because a part of the Date with Destiny experience is intentional sleep deprivation.
Right.
And the fact that you're typically getting about 4 hours of sleep per night. And so I'm just curious as to how the crew handled that and what they came away from the event with, how they felt about it.
Yeah, those are great questions. You sure you haven't done film interviews before?
I'm up to 150 podcast episodes.
All right, cool. All right, cool. No, on the one hand, it was a very easy shoot a very easy production schedule in the sense that, look, the Paradise Lost trilogy was 3 films over 2 years. So not 2 years when I done it, 2 decades. I've covered stories for years, months, The usual shooting period of a documentary is you're following a story over the course of 6 months or a year, something like that. This was 6 days for the entire components of what will constitute this film. On the other hand, they were 6 very intense days. He's on stage 12 hours, then he's tweaking the day with his staff after the day ends, it was amazing that how he downloads with his staff, what went on that day, what went well, what lessons can they learn. Then he tweaks the day for the next day. And I found all that quite fascinating. But, and of course for production, you have to be ready. You have to be the first one there and the last one to leave. So, we were also getting his morning routine. So our days, some days we got 2 and 3 hours of sleep because, we were, the first one's there, the last one's to go. They're long days. So it was exhausting for the crew. It's interesting how the crew reacted. Most of the guys on the crew were people I've worked with for a long, long time. I've taken them around the world to, we've covered some hairy stories in some, dangerous places over the years. So they're veteran, cynical, skeptical journalists / news gatherers. And I think initially they were a little like, they were willing to do the film because they trust me, and we have a long-standing relationship, but I think the attitude was like, oh God, what has Joe gotten us into now? And I think everyone entered in very skeptically. And I think by the end of it, and in fact, we had a nice kind of debrief, and that's the word I was looking for before, that Tony does a debrief with his staff after each day. So, but we had a debrief with Tony. Tony wanted to know what the crew thought of it, and people gave their honest reactions. And, some deeply were moved by it, and some went from extreme skepticism to an acceptance of what it is, but didn't necessarily feel it was for them. But for the most part, people were deeply moved and touched, at the very least, by observing the journeys of others. And it was interesting, our job is to observe and capture, which is, not the easiest thing to do. And a couple of my cameraman told me that, he felt the pull of, even though he had to look through the lens and do his job and think about all sorts of things that a cameraman thinks about, some of the sequences were so moving, he felt himself getting drawn in as a participant, and then had to snap himself back out of it and say, no, I've got to cover this. I'm here to observe. So there was an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, I could imagine that. And so you guys, you wrap up the week, you've got 6 days worth of footage. And at that point, you mentioned earlier, you didn't have a home for this yet as far as funding goes and all of that. So how did you pitch this and ultimately win with Netflix? And were there other distribution venues that turned it down?
Actually, not really. I went to Netflix pretty early. We had just finished a film, Radical Media, which is the company I'm a partner in. Radical Media had just finished a film on Nina Simone, the jazz singer. She's more than that. She's a legend. And we had done another film on Keith Richards. So we were building a relationship with Netflix, and I had done a film a few years ago called Crude, which also had some Netflix funding, but that one was before the current incarnation of what Netflix has become in the streaming business. But I just felt they were a perfect partner for this film for many reasons. And it's borne itself out in how the film has been received. I just thought this is the type of film where if you're going to be into it, you're going to want to see it more than once, and you're going to want to maybe even roll back on something, because the film is just chock full of wisdom and interesting stories that, you may want to hear more than once. And I also love the idea that, 190 countries and 81 million subscribers. And the idea that you could launch a film like this, which is intended to send out a positive message in the world and some positivity, the fact that the film could like that, because when it's a Netflix original, it means you can only see it on Netflix, but they also push it out in a very big way. Many films end up on Netflix as the final stop of their distribution cycle, but they don't get promoted the way a Netflix original does. So this is a film that got pushed out onto their platform worldwide, just as the company is growing. And the response has been incredible. If you go to the hashtag I am not your guru, and actually it's done, sometimes people are doing it I am not your guru, and some people are doing it as in I am not your guru. So it's spelled two different ways, I-A-M and I am not your guru on social media. But if you go to those hashtags, like on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the outpouring of love and support from around the world. I've gotten notes and emails and social media posts from, Cambodia, Colombia, UK, you name it, Australia. Just the world over, people have had an immediate and positive response to the film. So to me, it was that kind of a film where I just wanted to quickly build connections between people through this film. And I think Netflix was the perfect partner. So they came on pretty early. They saw some footage and jumped in, gave me some very helpful notes about how to shape the film. And it really is right for them. Although the one thing that is the one downside of it being a Netflix release, and it's minimal compared to the major impact we've had, is that, I'm a movie maker who started making films or making documentaries for the cinema, which, I want people to see my films in a big room. And the film has just come off of, prior to its Netflix release, we had a film festival run where the film has played at quite a few prominent film festivals. In fact, we just came back from Michael Moore's film festival called the Traverse City Film Festival. Michael really responded incredibly positively to the film. And there is something about seeing this film in a room, a darkened screen in a room full of, 500-600 people. We had like 4 sold out screenings at Traverse City Film Festival, literally with, 700-800 seat cinemas. And there's something really amazingly positive about this film, about the communal experience being seen in a communal experience. So my one slight disappointment in an otherwise amazingly positive relationship and outcome of the Netflix only situation is that when it has played in a big room, it's played really, really well.
What did it feel like what is the experience you're going through the day that this goes live? Because I've launched a lot of products in my career, and that's always an exciting / nerve-wracking day. A lot of expectations that you kind of have to keep your fingers crossed about. So what did that experience like? Where were you? Did you guys sit down and watch it when it went live on Netflix? But what did that day look like?
Tony and I were actually in Los Angeles doing, we did a pretty big press tour for the film in New York and then in LA, and we were in LA. And I think it was when I started seeing the comments, and not just one, tens of thousands of comments on the first weekend. On the first weekend on Twitter, the number 1 trending story was the coup in Turkey. But the number 2 trending story was, I am not your guru, which is pretty amazing. It was just an immediate positive response. So the degree to which I have never seen for one of my films before. So that was overwhelmingly positive and actually doubly sweet, because one of the things that's been disappointing about the release of the film is that some of the reviews have been quite critical. And, look, this is my 12th feature documentary. I've done hundreds of hours of television. I'm used to reviews. I've generally been blessed with good reviews. And I learned early in my career, you can't validate yourself artistically by the reviews, because if you believe the good reviews, you also have to believe the bad reviews. So it's just much healthier not to validate your artistic worth by what other people who don't make these things, but just write about them, say about you. I've had some bad reviews in my career and I've had some great reviews in my career. But these reviews were not only dismissive of the film, but really mean and nasty. The New York Times, which has generally blessed my work with, great praise, really ripped the film to shreds and dismissed it as a promo film. But not just dismissed it, but, personally attacking me, personally attacking Tony Robbins, and in fact, personally attacking all those people out there in the movie who who attended Date with Destiny, who had a positive experience. And the level of negativity that the reviewers, look, a reviewer is free to criticize the film and say what's wrong with it. That's fine. But there was such an edge and a negative tone that it really surprised me, and the vindication, therefore, look, if people hated the movie, if the real people in the real world hated the movie and the reviews stunk, that's a sign that maybe you're not on the right track. But there's been such a disconnect between the incredibly positive love and support and positive comments. We've had people stand up at screenings who've said, I came here thinking I wanted to hate Tony, but, I just got over a cancer treatment and this film is really going to help me get me through it. we've had comments on social media, about that, about all sorts of issues that people are grappling with. Michael Moore, who is, you would think one of the biggest cynics around, given what he's done filmically and what, his success is based on, like me. I mean, I was a cynic before I made this film, has said repeatedly that this is a film that's going to save lives, So to have those kinds of comments, and I've heard, I don't want to name drop, but, both Tony and I have gotten unprompted emails and communication from some huge names in the world, in the entertainment business and elsewhere, just saying how moved they've been by the film. So for critics to dismiss it as a promo film, or, I missed the opportunity to reveal what a fraud he is, or that, the people attending these events are just, a bunch of criers. I mean, it's just been shocking to hear the reviews, yet the film has been so embraced. It's one of Netflix's biggest successes in terms of the amount of people who saw it on the opening weekend for a documentary. It's been, incredible. So, and my theory about it is that, I think maybe this is too inside baseball for your listeners, but I think we live in, obviously very divisive times. And I think documentary has become synonymous with negative takedown pieces, wagging a finger at the latest social ill. And now I'm not knocking that, even though it sounds like I am. I am not knocking that at all. I've made those kinds of films. Michael Moore has made those kinds of films. Those kinds of films are necessary because, we live in an age where the internet has kind of gutted the tradition of print investigative journalism. We live in an age where a few corporations now own all of the television broadcast networks. And so there is this blurred line between entertainment and news, and a fear of offending advertisers by covering certain stories. So into that void has stepped the independent documentarian to really shine a light on social ills that need addressing. So that's important, but I think in the minds of many people, unless you're ripping some institution to shreds or exposing somebody to be a fraud, then it's not a legitimate documentary. And I think I think the reviewers, especially coming from somebody like me who has made a lot of these kinds of films, they're like waiting for the shoe to drop. And in fact, when the shoe doesn't drop, when I just kind of drop you into this immersive world of Tony's experience, I think some reviewers are disappointed that I don't take him to task, but I went in to investigate, and what I came out with was an incredibly positive human experience that I wanted to share. And the vast majority of people attending that event, share my point of view. So there is no dark side to present. And more importantly, one of the biggest criticisms has been, that the film is not objective. And I don't quite know what that means. I drop you into the world of this event and faithfully present what it's like to be there. And it's up to you to decide whether you're repulsed by it or whether you get something out of it. I actually think it's one of the most objective films I've ever made because I don't tell you what to think. I show you that Tony's wealthy. So is that wealth aspirational or is it off-putting? It's for you to decide. I show people going through transformations. Do these transformations last or not? It's up for you to decide. Is this something you will get something out of? It's up for you to decide. It's a concert film, a concert of human emotion is what I like to call it. And just like in a rock and roll concert film, when the camera glides by the drummer, during a song, it's not up to the filmmaker to say whether that drumming is good or not, or better on the live, on the studio album versus live. And when the camera pans by the lead singer, the filmmaker isn't supposed to whisper into your ear, hey, that lead singer, is having an affair with the drummer's wife. I'm dropping you into an experience and you can decide what you think about it.
It's funny. I do a lot of advertising on a daily basis for my primary business, and, a couple $1,000s a day in ad spend on Facebook. And part of my day is checking on the comments that have been, left overnight on the ads. And half of them are good and half of them are negative. And the funny part about the negative ones is that they are all left by people who have never experienced a single product of mine.
Yeah.
And so it just reminds me of the same thing as all of these critics, who are being negative. None of them have ever been to a Tony Robbins event. So
exactly. And look, a film reviewer is certainly, it's fair game for a film reviewer. If they don't like my filmmaking, well, if they don't like the filmmaking or the directing, they're certainly free to say that. But to dismiss a whole class of people that you don't, that you think their experience is not legitimate, to me, that's touching on kind of dangerous ground.
A lot of the people listening to this right now are entrepreneurs, and such a big part of being an entrepreneur is learning the art of storytelling. And do you have a single resource that you would recommend that people could go read, whether it's a book or a movie to watch or something that really can communicate and teach them the art of telling an effective story? The hero's journey, for example, I know is always kind of a go-to.
Yeah. I mean, Joseph Campbell, Power of Myth is always something that one should understand the basic elements of storytelling. It depends what form it's taking in, but Joseph Campbell's my hero. So that's who I consult from time to time.
There you go. I don't think you can get a bigger endorsement than that.
Yeah.
So Joe, I have a question that I ask a few of our guests when I think their answer would be really relevant to our audience today. But what is your biggest challenge today? You've come out of the event, you've released the movie, but has that shown a light on your life, either from a personal standpoint or a business standpoint? Like, hey, there's an opportunity for me to grow here, and how can we support you in that?
I think this whole experience of, delving into films about human consciousness is a whole new area that I am going to explore. I'm a guy who's really done a lot of very specific social issue films, criminal justice films. I certainly will continue doing those. But, I had this epiphany while making this film, and it's something I'd like to continue on. And that is, I just think, I keep saying it, we live in very divisive times, and it just seems to be getting worse. And I think the more we honor people like Tony Robbins, who tries to bring people together, and the whole experience of making this film, my goal was to have people spend 2 hours thinking about the direction of their own lives, and more importantly, their connections to other people and their connection to their self. Because let's face it, if you're more connected to yourself, if you feel more fulfilled, you're going to be a better person. And if people feel more connected, perhaps there would be less strife in the world. And I know that's very Pollyannish, but suicide bombers are not happy, connected people. The shooters of police officers are not happy people. So I feel like I'm now, in addition to my social justice filmmaking work, I feel like I have a real mission, to make films that shed light on human consciousness and human connectivity, because I actually think that is very much related to my other work. Because I think if we all felt more connected to ourselves, more fulfilled, more understanding what our sense of mission is in life, whatever that is, and if we feel more connected to one another, perhaps there would be less social ills for documentarians to have to point their cameras at. Now, do I think that, social ills are ever going to end? Probably not. But that was kind of the creative impulse, that led me to make this film, and it has kind of set me on this new path of mine.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story about this. And, I've been waiting to watch this with two friends of mine specifically who recently had to deal with a family tragedy. One of their brothers was recently paralyzed while playing in a pool with his kids. And so that's been really, really, really tough on their family. And so on our agenda is to really watch this film together, and to not only watch it for family support's sake, but to make sure that he watches it as well, because it is such a transformational experience. And I can say personally that I went to this event because I had just gone through 3 of the most difficult years of my life: divorce, broken business, all kinds of horrendous stuff. And this is really what pulled me out of that funk and was part of the inspiration to start this podcast.
Oh, wow. Great.
So I can say we are here talking together as a result of my attendance to Date with Destiny 2 years ago.
Oh, cool. And I'm sorry you went through those things, but you know how great a reframing of your experiences that Tony leads you to can help you deal with those things.
Absolutely. So I would really, really, really encourage everybody who is listening to this to do two things. Go to Netflix, watch I Am Not Your Guru, leave an awesome review if you feel that it deserves one, and I'm sure that that will be the case. And then I would highly recommend that you guys get to Date with Destiny. Tony only does it once a year. It's coming up in November. And if there are still tickets available, I would be surprised because I know that it sells out months and months in advance. But if you have that opportunity, it was the single most life-changing event that I have ever attended. So, Joe, thank you for shining a light on Tony and his story and what he's doing for the world. And
cool. I think it's actually in December, by the way, the Date with Destiny.
Oh, did I not say December?
You said November.
Yeah. I think the one we went to was in November, which is why I was thinking that. But yeah, you're right. It's December 8th through 13th this year.
Yeah, and he also does one in Australia. If anyone is listening and wants to go to Australia, once a year.
Perfect. And so, Joe, where can people connect with you and follow your work?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, which is, my handle is @Joe Berlinger. My website is joeberlingerfilms.com. And I think those are the places. I'm one of those lame people who hasn't entered Facebook or Instagram yet. So one of these days I will get my act together.
God bless you, Joe.
My kids keep telling me you're not on Facebook, but I'm not. So someone convinced me 4 or 5 years ago to do Twitter, and I actually enjoy it. But that's the limit to my social media for some reason. I'm in the 20th century with regard to other social media. So at Joe Berlinger on Twitter, and probably at Joe Berlinger on Facebook and Instagram eventually, but hasn't happened yet.
Awesome. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. It was a lot of fun, a fascinating story, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And guys, go check out the film, tell the world about it. And Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Watch them grow. Watch them grow.